They left him to die in the sun, but they didn't know who he was, and they had no idea who she was about to become. Picture this: Jerome, Arizona, a town clinging to the side of a mountain like a stubborn hawk, scorched by a July sun that offered no mercy. In the center of the town square, a man was on his knees, ropes bit deep into his wrists, tied to a hitching post. A filthy burlap sack was pulled tight over his head, turning the world into a hot, suffocating blackness. The heat in Jerome doesn't just burn your skin, it gets inside your lungs and boils you from the inside out. Sweat carved clean trails through the grime on his bare back, revealing the kind of muscle you only get from two things: hard labor or harder fights. And the whole town was watching. At first they'd been a mob, full of rocks and rage, but the midday sun had baked the anger right out of them, leaving behind a lazy, cruel kind of entertainment. They stood in the slivers of shade cast by the storefronts, fanning themselves, laughing. A kid, no older than 10, picked up a stone and threw it. It sailed wide, kicking up a puff of dust. Nobody stopped him. He picked up another. A stray dog barked once, a half-hearted sound, then slumped back down in the dirt, its tongue lolling out. It was like the whole world had decided this was normal. This was just another Tuesday. They said he'd been found out by the old Copper Queen mine. They said he had another man's blood on his hands and another man's satchel slung over his shoulder. No one saw it happen. There was no trial, just a story that got passed from one thirsty mouth to another until it hardened into fact. And in a town like Jerome, a good story was all the proof you needed. The sheriff, a man named Barlow, leaned against the post, chewing on a piece of dried grass. He watched the scene with his eyes half closed under the brim of his hat, like this was just a show put on for his amusement. And that's when she rode in, Nora Whitfield, 38 years old, a widow for 3 of them. She had the kind of eyes that had seen too much and a spine made of pure iron. She wasn't from Jerome. She was just passing through looking for a cool drink of water and an hour of shade before pushing on. But when her horse clopped into that silent, watching square, her eyes landed on the man kneeling in the dirt. And unlike everyone else, she didn't look away. There was something in the way he held himself. He was bound and helpless, but he wasn't broken. He held his head up under that sack, his shoulders straight, as if he were a king on a throne of dust. And that stillness pulled at something deep inside her. Something she thought had died 3 years ago. Her hands, worn and calloused, tightened on the leather reins. In her saddlebags, wrapped in oilcloth, was the only thing of value she had left in this world: her late husband's Colt. 45, a peacemaker with a walnut grip worn smooth by his touch. In a town like this, that gun was worth a fortune. More than the sheriff made in a year. She didn't know the condemned man's name. She didn't know his crime. But in that moment, she knew she was about to trade the last piece of her past for a stranger's future. Nora swung down from the saddle. Her boots sank into the deep, powdery dust, the sound muffled by the oppressive heat. The town's lazy chatter died. Every eye turned to her. The silence was so complete you could hear the creak of her leather vest, the faint jingle of a spur. Sheriff Barlow didn't move. He just watched her approach, that lazy, arrogant smirk playing on his lips. He thought he knew what was about to happen. He was wrong. She stopped a few feet from him, the sun beating down on her, the heat shimmering in the air between them, like a wall of glass. "You lost, ma'am?" Barlow drawled, not bothering to take the grass stem from his mouth. Nora didn't answer. Her hand moved slowly, deliberately, toward her saddlebag. She felt the cold, heavy steel of the Colt through the leather. She hadn't planned on ever letting it go. It was the last thing he had ever touched. But then, she hadn't planned on watching a man be cooked alive while the law looked on. She pulled the revolver out. The silver finish gleamed, so bright it hurt to look at. She held it out to him, grip first. "This is worth more than any fine you'll ever collect," she said, her voice steady and clear. "It's worth more than the man you're about to kill." Barlow's eyes widened, just a fraction. He finally took the grass stem out of his mouth. He took the Colt, his fingers tracing the worn grip. He weighed it in his hand, feeling its perfect balance. It was a gentleman's gun, a beautiful, deadly piece of history, a flicker of something, greed, recognition, crossed his face before he masked it. You aiming to trade this for him? He asked, nodding his head toward the man in the dirt. Nora just stared at him, a silent, unblinking challenge. The sheriff let out a low chuckle, a dry, rattling sound. Well, I'll be. Guess that's a yes. He looked over his shoulder at one of his deputies, a lanky kid with pimples on his chin. Go on, cut him loose. The deputy looked confused. But Sheriff, Blackwood said, I know what Blackwood said, Barlow snapped, his voice suddenly sharp as a razor. He never took his eyes off Nora. The man's debt has been paid. Now cut him loose. The deputy scurried over and with a quick slash of his knife, cut the ropes. Then he yanked the burlap sack off the man's head. The sudden, blinding sunlight made him squint. His face was weathered, carved by sun and wind, with a jaw that could cut stone. But it was his eyes that held you. They were a piercing, clear gray, and they were completely steady. No fear, no pleading, no gratitude. He just looked at Nora, a long, unreadable gaze. He was a puzzle she couldn't solve, and maybe that's why she'd done it. He stood up slowly, rolling his shoulders as if reacquainting himself with freedom. The townsfolk started muttering among themselves. They'd been cheated out of their afternoon's entertainment. The sheriff, meanwhile, tucked the beautiful Colt 45 into his own belt, patting it like a new friend. He's all yours now, ma'am, Barlow said, his lazy smile returning. And whatever trouble was his, well, now it's yours too. Nora didn't grace him with a reply. She just turned and walked back to her horse. The stranger followed a few paces behind, his steps silent in the dust. She climbed into the saddle, and he swung up behind her without a word, his weight solid and sure. It was a strange kind of intimacy, the heat of his body against her back, his arm brushing hers. They rode out of Jerome, the silent judgment of 100 pairs of eyes following them until they were nothing but a shimmer in the heat. The road ahead was a long, dusty ribbon stretching into nowhere. But Nora had a gut feeling, cold and certain as a snake in the shadows. This wasn't over. It was just getting started. They rode for an hour, maybe more, long enough for the cursed town of Jerome to shrink into a bad memory. The sun was starting to dip, painting the jagged cliffs in shades of orange and purple. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was heavy, filled with unspoken questions. Nora was intensely aware of the man behind her, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the solid weight of him. He hadn't said a single word. Not thank you, not where are we going, nothing. He was just there, a dangerous, silent presence she had just bought and paid for with the last piece of her heart. The road began to narrow, winding through a canyon where the rock walls rose up on either side of them, like ancient, silent giants. The shadows grew long and deep, and that's when she saw them. 2 riders waiting up ahead. They were sitting on their horses, perfectly still, blocking the path. Their hats were pulled low, casting their faces in shadow. They held rifles across their laps, not aiming, just holding them with a lazy confidence that set every nerve in Nora's body on fire. She'd seen men like this before, vultures waiting for something to die. Her stomach clenched into a tight, cold knot. She kept her horse moving at the same steady pace, not wanting to spook them, but her fingers tightened on the reins until her knuckles were white. What would you do? Keep riding toward them? Or turn back toward the town that wanted you dead? As they got closer, one of the men nudged his horse forward. He had a cruel, thin mouth and eyes that were little more than slits. Well now, he drawled, his voice like gravel scraping on rock. Look what we got here. A fine-looking horse and a mighty, resilient-looking partner you got there. The other man, a brute with a face like a sack of smashed potatoes, let out a wet, toothless chuckle. Sheriff Barlow sends his regards, the first man said. He says you forgot your receipt. So that was it. Barlow hadn't just taken her gun, he'd sent his dogs to collect the rest. They weren't just robbers. They were collectors. Nora opened her mouth, ready to bluff, to bargain, to say anything to buy a few seconds of time, but she never got the chance. The man behind her moved. It wasn't a frantic scramble. It was a single fluid motion. One moment he was sitting behind her, the next his boots were hitting the dusty ground. He didn't run. He walked toward them, calm and deliberate, like he was walking into his own home. He moved with a kind of deadly grace that was terrifying to watch. The first rider, the one with the gravelly voice, smirked and started to raise his rifle. He thought he had all the time in the world. He was wrong. In 3 long strides, the stranger closed the distance. He grabbed the rifle barrel, twisted it with a sharp crack of wood and bone, and pulled the man clean out of his saddle. The rider hit the ground with a sickening thud, the air rushing out of his lungs in a pained grunt. The second man, the brute, fumbled for the pistol at his hip, his eyes wide with panic. He was too slow, way too slow. The stranger was already on him, yanking him from his horse with one hand and sending his gun flying into the rocks with the other. It was over in less than 5 seconds. No shouting, no drawn-out struggle, just the swift, brutal efficiency of a predator. 2 men who had been the masters of this canyon moments before were now just groaning heaps of dust and regret. The stranger calmly walked over to the first man's rifle, checked it, and then climbed back onto the horse behind Nora as if nothing had happened. He slung the captured rifle over his shoulder. Now they had a weapon. Nora's heart was hammering against her ribs. Her mouth was dry. She couldn't form a single word. She had saved a man from a slow death, and in return, she had just witnessed a display of violence so fast and so final, it made her blood run cold. Who was this man? She turned her head slightly to look at him. His expression was unchanged, calm, watchful. Those gray eyes met hers, and for the first time he spoke. His voice was low and rough, like stones rolling in a riverbed. "They'll send more," he said. It wasn't a guess, it was a promise. He was right. They didn't have to wait long. The sun had bled out of the sky, leaving behind a bruised twilight that made it hard to see. They had pushed the horse hard, trying to put as much distance as possible between them and those 2 broken men. Nora kept glancing over her shoulder, her ears straining for the sound of hoofbeats. The stranger behind her was unnervingly still, a silent sentinel scanning the darkening landscape. The air grew colder, and the silence of the desert night pressed in on them. Then a sound. Not hoofbeats, a single sharp crow's call from the ridge to their left. It sounded wrong. Too sharp, too deliberate. An echo of the call came from the right. A signal. "Get down!" The stranger's voice was a harsh whisper in her ear. Before she could react, he was pulling her sideways, tumbling from the saddle and dragging her with him into the cover of a thick patch of mesquite. They hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind out of her. Their horse, spooked, bolted a few yards before stopping, its ears twitching nervously. Lying in the dirt, peering through the thorny branches, Nora saw them. Silhouettes against the last light. 3 riders on the ridge to their left. 2 more emerging from a dry wash up ahead. 5 of them. And they weren't the clumsy thugs from before. These men moved with a purpose, fanning out, their rifles held at the ready. This wasn't an ambush. This was a hunt. "They wanted us on the road," the stranger murmured, his breath warm against her cheek. "Easier to box us in." He was already moving, crawling deeper into the scrub, pulling the captured rifle with him. He didn't seem scared. He seemed angry, like a cornered wolf. "The horse is a target. We leave it." Leave it? Her horse was her life, her only way of moving through this God-forsaken country. But looking at the cold, professional way those men were closing in, she knew he was right. They weren't after the horse. They were after them. Or more specifically, they were after him. What in God's name had he done to earn this kind of attention? The first shot cracked through the twilight, splintering the rock just inches from where their heads had been. The sound echoed through the canyon, loud as a thunderclap. Her horse screamed, a sound of pure terror, and galloped off into the darkness. Now they were on foot, stranded, hunted. "This way," he hissed, grabbing her arm. His grip was like iron. He pulled her along, half crawling, half running, staying low to the ground. The desert floor was a minefield of sharp rocks and thorny plants that tore at her clothes and skin. Behind them she could hear the men shouting, their voices closing in. They were following the horse's tracks, but soon they'd find where they jumped off. Soon they'd be on their trail. They scrambled down into a rocky gulch. The stones were loose, and twice Nora slipped, her boots finding no purchase. Each time his hand was there, steadying her, pulling her onward. The gulch twisted and turned, a dark snake carved into the earth. For a few minutes the shouting faded, and Nora allowed herself a sliver of hope. Maybe they had lost them. But then they came around a sharp bend, and the gulch opened up into a small, moonlit clearing, and waiting for them, standing beside a small campfire as if he'd been expecting them all along, was Sheriff Barlow. He wasn't alone. The two thugs from the canyon were with him, looking bruised but furious. And standing next to Barlow was another man, a man dressed in a fine black coat, his face pale and cruel in the flickering firelight. He held Nora's Colt, .45 in his hand, spinning the cylinder with a soft, menacing click. Barlow saw them, and his lazy smile returned. "Evening, ma'am," he said, his voice dripping with false courtesy. "Fancy meeting you here. Seems your new friend is a very popular man." The man in the black coat stepped forward. He ignored Nora completely. His eyes, cold and dark as a winter night, were locked on the stranger. "Silas," the man said, his voice smooth and deadly, "you have something that belongs to me. The satchel. Where is it?" So he had a name, Silas, and he was a thief. The story from Jerome was true after all. She had risked everything for a common criminal. A wave of sickness and betrayal washed over Nora. But then Silas did something unexpected. He slowly straightened up from his crouch and stepped out into the firelight, shielding Nora behind him. He didn't look at the man in black. He looked at the satchel, the same satchel he'd supposedly been caught with, the one the townsfolk had mentioned, but it wasn't in the man's hands. "Where is it, Blackwood?" Silas asked, his voice a low growl. The man named Blackwood smiled. It was a terrible sight. "Oh, it's safe, but I'm afraid the price for its return has gone up. It will cost you the map and her." He gestured with the Colt .45, its barrel pointing directly at Nora's heart. It was a trap. The entire thing had been a meticulously planned trap, from the moment she rode into Jerome. The man on the post, the trade, the ambush. It was all a performance designed to lead Silas right here. And she had been the unwitting pawn who led the wolf into the snare. Barlow had played her perfectly. He hadn't wanted the gun for its value. He'd wanted it because he knew its new owner, Mr. Blackwood, would enjoy using it to kill her. The air crackled with tension. Silas stood between her and Blackwood's gun, his body a rigid line of defiance. He had the rifle, but there were at least 7 of them, all armed. It was an impossible fight, a slaughter waiting to happen. Blackwood cocked the hammer on the Colt. The sound was deafening in the silence of the night. "Last chance, Silas. The map. Or the woman dies with a bullet from her husband's own gun." Her husband's gun. The words hit Nora like a physical blow. Her blood went ice cold. It couldn't be. Her husband, John, had been a simple rancher. He died in a riding accident 3 years ago. His body was buried in a small cemetery 100 miles from here. What did any of this have to do with him? How could Blackwood possibly know about his gun? Silas's shoulders tensed. He glanced back at her, and for the first time, she saw something in his eyes besides cold calculation. It was a flicker of regret, of shared history. "Nora," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "I'm sorry. I never wanted to bring you into this. John, he never wanted this for you." He knew John's name. This stranger, this supposed thief, knew her dead husband's name. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Everything she thought she knew was a lie. Her husband's death, the gun, this man kneeling in the dust, it was all connected, a dark and tangled web, and she was caught right in the center of it. Blackwood's smile widened. He had them. He knew he had them. "Tick-tock, Silas," Blackwood purred. But Silas wasn't looking at Blackwood anymore. He was looking at something over Blackwood's shoulder, into the darkness of the gulch behind him. A slow, dangerous smile spread across his own face. "You know, Blackwood," Silas said, his voice suddenly calm, almost conversational. "You talk too much." And then from the darkness behind the campfire, a second rifle shot cracked the night. It wasn't aimed at them. It was aimed at Blackwood's men. One of the riders on the ridge cried out and tumbled from his saddle. Chaos erupted. Blackwood spun around, his face a mask of fury and confusion. They weren't alone. Silas had led them into a trap of his own. Gunfire exploded from all sides. It wasn't just one hidden shooter. It was three, maybe four. They were positioned in the rocks above the clearing, laying down a withering crossfire. Blackwood's men, caught completely by surprise in the open firelight, scrambled for cover, firing blindly into the darkness. Sheriff Barlow, the coward he was, dove behind a cluster of boulders, leaving his boss to fend for himself. "Now!" Silas roared, grabbing Nora's hand and pulling her toward the opposite side of the clearing, away from the firefight. Bullets whizzed past their heads, chewing up the dirt at their feet. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and fear. Nora's mind was reeling. Who were these other shooters? Friends of Silas? How had he known they would be here? They plunged into the darkness of the narrow canyon, Silas leading the way, his grip on her hand unbreakable. Behind them, the gun battle raged, the shouts and screams echoing off the canyon walls. They ran, stumbling over rocks, their lungs burning, until the sounds of the fight began to fade behind them. They didn't stop until they reached a small, hidden alcove, a deep shadow carved into the rock. Silas finally let go of her hand and slumped against the wall, breathing heavily. He peered back the way they had come, listening. The shooting had subsided, replaced by an eerie silence. Nora leaned against the cool stone, trying to catch her breath, her mind a whirlwind of questions. "Who were they?" she gasped. "Your friends?" Silas shook his head. He pulled a small, battered tin from his pocket and began expertly rolling a cigarette, his hands steady despite the adrenaline. "Not friends," he said, striking a match on the rock wall. The flame briefly illuminated his face, showing the deep lines of exhaustion and something else. Grief. They were John's friends. They'd been watching Blackwood's men for weeks, waiting for him to make a move. He took a long drag from the cigarette, the ember glowing in the dark. John wasn't a rancher, Nora. Not just a rancher. He was an agent for the Pinkertons. He was investigating Marcus Blackwood and his illegal mining operations, the ones that have been poisoning the water for 100 miles and making him rich. Nora felt her knees go weak. The Pinkertons. Her quiet, gentle John. A detective. It didn't make any sense. "No," she whispered. "He died. An accident. His horse threw him." Silas looked at her, and the pity in his gray eyes was a knife to her heart. "It wasn't an accident, Nora. Blackwood found out who he was. He had him murdered. They made it look like a fall." He took another drag, the smoke curling around his face. "I was his partner. I was supposed to meet him the day he died. I was late. By the time I got there, he was gone, and Blackwood's men were waiting for me." Every word was a blow, shattering the world she had carefully rebuilt over the last 3 years. The grief she had learned to live with was suddenly transformed into a raw, burning rage. Her husband hadn't left her. He had been taken from her, stolen, and the man responsible had just held her husband's own gun to her heart. "The satchel," she said, the pieces clicking into place with horrifying clarity. "The blood." "The blood was mine," Silas said grimly, "from the fight when they caught me. The satchel was John's. It doesn't have a map in it. It has his ledger, all the proof we need to bring Blackwood down. Names, dates, shipments, everything. That's what he's really after. He thinks I have it hidden somewhere. He'd been framed, left to die in Jerome, not for murder, but to silence him, to get the location of that ledger. And Blackwood had used her grief and her husband's memory to smoke him out. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. "So where is it?" Nora asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "The ledger. Where did you hide it?" Silas looked down at his boots, then back up at her. His expression was grim. "I didn't," he said. "I never got my hands on it. The day they killed John, he must have known they were coming for him. He hid it somewhere safe, somewhere only he would know." He paused, letting the weight of his next words sink in. When they caught me, I was searching his saddlebags, hoping he'd left a clue. I found nothing. Barlow planted the story about the satchel to give Blackwood a reason to hold me. But the truth is, I have no idea where it is. The hope that had flared in her chest died in an instant. The proof they needed to avenge John was lost. Blackwood had won. He would hunt them down, and without the ledger, all they had was the word of a wanted man against the most powerful man in the territory. They were as good as dead. But then, a memory surfaced. Something John had said to her, a long time ago, laughing as he polished that beautiful Colt. 45. Everything I value is right here, Nora, in my hands or close enough to touch. She had thought he meant her and the gun. But what if he meant something more literal? Her eyes went wide. Silas, she said, her voice trembling with a new terrifying idea. Barlow took the gun. Blackwood has it now. I know, he said, his voice flat with defeat. No, you don't understand, she insisted, her heart beginning to pound again. The grip, on the right side. John, he was always tinkering with it. He said the wood was loose. He fitted a small metal plate inside the handle to tighten it up. Silas stared at her, his cigarette forgotten, slowly burning down between his fingers. He was starting to understand. It's not a map Blackwood is looking for, Nora whispered, the realization dawning on her with chilling certainty. It's a key, and John hid it in plain sight. He hid it inside the grip of his own gun. The ledger wasn't lost. The proof they needed was in the hands of their deadliest enemy. The silence in the alcove was absolute. Silas stared at her, the glowing ember of his cigarette the only light in the darkness. The implication of what she'd said hung between them, heavy and terrifying. The key to Blackwood's downfall, the very thing John had died to protect, was now a toy in the monster's hand. He was holding the instrument of his own destruction and had no idea. Are you sure? Silas finally asked, his voice a low rasp. He called it his little secret, Nora said, memories flooding back. He was so proud of his craftsmanship. He showed me how the plate was almost invisible unless you knew exactly where to press. Her mind raced. The trade in the square. Barlow's flicker of recognition when he held the gun. He hadn't just seen a valuable weapon. Had he known? Was it possible he knew about the secret compartment? Barlow knew, Silas said, voicing her thought. That's why he was so eager to make the trade. He wasn't just getting a gun for Blackwood. He was delivering the key. He was probably planning on using that information to get a bigger piece of the pie. It made a twisted kind of sense. The sheriff wasn't just a hired thug. He was a snake playing his own game. Suddenly, the night didn't feel safe anymore. The hidden shooters, John's friends, had saved them, but they couldn't protect them forever. Blackwood and Barlow would regroup. They would tear the desert apart looking for them. And once Blackwood got tired of searching, he would eventually examine his new prize. He would find that loose plate. He would find the key, and then he would find whatever lock it opened. We have to get it back, Nora said, the words coming out before she had even fully formed the thought. It was insane, suicidal. Blackwood would be holed up, surrounded by his men. Going after him would be walking directly into the lion's den. Silas dropped the butt of his cigarette and crushed it under his heel. Getting that gun back is impossible, Nora. He'll be at his stronghold by now. The Obsidian Ranch. It's a fortress. He has 24 men on his payroll. John's friends, she started, are good men, good fighters. But they're not an army, Silas cut her off. They can harass him, pick off his patrols. But a frontal assault on that ranch? It would be a massacre. Our massacre. He paced the small space, his frustration a palpable force. John's plan was to get the ledger and take it to the territorial marshal in Prescott to use the law. A gunfight was the last thing he wanted. The law? Nora scoffed, the sound bitter. The law is a man named Barlow who left you to die in the sun and then tried to have us murdered. The law is whatever Marcus Blackwood decides it is. John tried to do it the right way, and it got him killed. I'm not making that mistake. The fire that had been smoldering inside her since she'd learned the truth about John's death now roared to life. It burned away the grief, the fear, the years of quiet resignation. In their place was a cold, hard certainty. She was done running. She was done being a victim. "What does the key open?" she asked, her voice hard as steel. Silas stopped pacing and looked at her. He saw the change in her eyes, the transformation from a weary widow to something far more dangerous. A safe box. At the bank in Jerome. John rented it under a false name. That's where he kept the real ledger. The satchel he was carrying was a decoy, filled with false information, just in case he was captured. Of course, John had always been clever, always 3 steps ahead. He had a plan and a backup plan. He just never planned on being betrayed. "So the ledger is safe," Nora said. "All we need is the key, and the key is on Blackwood." "It might as well be on the moon," Silas countered. "No," she said, stepping closer to him in the dark. "It's on a man. A vain, arrogant man who just got a brand new toy. A man who will want to show it off. He won't just lock it away. He'll carry it. He'll wear it on his hip." She took a breath, the plan forming in her mind, wild and desperate, but with a sliver of a chance. "You said his ranch is a fortress. We can't get in. But what if we could get him to come out?" Silas was silent for a long moment. He studied her face, seeing the iron resolve she had inherited, or perhaps had always possessed. He had seen that same look in John's eyes many times, right before he did something incredibly brave or incredibly stupid. "He's not going to just ride out for a picnic," Silas said dryly. "No," Nora agreed. "But he's a businessman, a greedy one. And his biggest investment is the Copper Queen mine, the one he stole, the one that's poisoning the land, the one that's making him rich." She paused, letting the idea settle. What would happen if someone threatened to destroy it? A slow, dangerous grin spread across Silas's face for the first time. It was a mirror of her own. He finally understood. They couldn't outfight Blackwood. They couldn't outrun him. So they were going to have to outsmart him. They were going to dangle the one thing he couldn't afford to lose right in front of his face and force him to come to them. "There's an old store of blasting powder in a deserted prospector's shack not 2 miles from here," Silas said, his voice alive with a new energy. "Enough to blow the main entrance to that mine halfway to Kingdom Come." "Then that's what we'll do," Nora said, her decision absolute. "We'll give him a choice. The gun for the mine." It was a bluff, a desperate high-stakes gamble. They had no intention of actually destroying the mine, but Blackwood wouldn't know that. All he would see was his empire on the brink of ruin. He would come, and he would bring the gun with him. "His men will be everywhere," Silas warned, the last voice of caution. "I know," Nora replied, "but this time it won't be his trap. It will be ours." They moved through the pre-dawn gloom like ghosts. Silas led the way to the old prospector's shack, a dilapidated structure leaning against the wind. Inside, just as he'd said, were several crates of dynamite, sweating nitroglycerin in the cool air. It was unstable, dangerous stuff, perfect for their plan. They carefully loaded several sticks, along with fuses and blasting caps, into a canvas sack. Next, Silas sought out John's friends. He disappeared into the rocks and returned an hour later with a wiry older man with a long gray beard and eyes that missed nothing. His name was Jeb. He was one of the 3 men who had provided the crossfire in the gulch. He had known John for years. When Nora told him her plan, he didn't flinch. He just nodded slowly, a grim respect in his eyes. "John would be proud of you, ma'am," he said, his voice raspy. "And he'd call you a damn fool, which is why we'll help." The plan was simple, which meant it had 1,000 ways to go wrong. Jeb and the others would create a diversion, drawing the bulk of Blackwood's patrols to the west of the mine. That would give Nora and Silas a window to get to the main entrance on the eastern side, plant the dynamite, and send their message. They would give Blackwood 1 hour to meet them at a designated spot, a high, lonely mesa that offered a clear view in all directions, making a large-scale ambush difficult. He was to come alone, with the Colt. 1 gun for 1 mine. A simple trade. Of course, they knew he wouldn't come alone, but he would come, and that's all that mattered. As the sun began to cast its first pale light over the horizon, Nora found herself standing at the edge of a ridge, looking down at the Copper Queen. It was an ugly scar on the land, a sprawling complex of machinery, tailings piles, and rough-hewn buildings. Armed guards patrolled its perimeter. It was Blackwood's heart, and they were about to place a knife to its throat. "Ready?" Silas asked, standing beside her. He held 2 sticks of dynamite in his hand. Nora looked at him. In the space of a single day, he had gone from a condemned stranger to the only ally she had in the world, a link to the husband she was only now beginning to understand. "I'm ready," she said. They began their descent just as the first sounds of gunfire echoed from the west. Jeb and his men had begun the diversion. Shouts and panicked commands rose from the mine complex below as guards scrambled to respond to the attack. It was working. The distraction had pulled most of the patrols away from the eastern entrance. Their window was open. They moved quickly, using the terrain for cover, until they reached the massive timber-framed entrance to the mine shaft. A single sleepy-looking guard stood watch. He never saw Silas coming. A swift, silent takedown, and the guard was unconscious, tied up with his own belt. They were in the clear. Silas expertly placed the dynamite against the main support beams, packing it with dirt. He cut a fuse, his hands working with practiced ease. "This will be enough to collapse the entrance," he said. "It won't destroy the mine, but it'll take him months to dig it out. Months of lost profits." "It's enough," Nora agreed. She took out a piece of paper and a charcoal pencil she'd gotten from Jeb. Her hand was steady as she wrote the terms. "The Mesa, 1 hour. Come alone with the gun, or your mind becomes a tomb. Your choice." They tied the note to the end of the long fuse. Silas lit it. The fuse sparked to life, a small, sizzling snake eating its way toward the explosives. "That gives us about 10 minutes, Silas said, grabbing her arm. "Let's go." They didn't run. They scrambled, climbing back up the rocky slope, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the mine entrance. They were halfway to the top when the world exploded behind them. The ground shook, and a deafening roar echoed through the canyon. A massive cloud of dust and debris erupted from the mine, blotting out the morning sun. The message had been sent. The clock was ticking. Now all they could do was get to the mesa and see if the devil would accept their invitation. The mesa was a flat-topped island of rock in a sea of sand and scrub, exposed on all sides. It was the perfect place for a duel and a terrible place to hide. By the time they arrived, the sun was high and hot. The air was still. The only sound was the wind whispering over the stone. From here, they could see for miles. They would see Blackwood coming long before he arrived, but he would also see them. Silas checked his rifle, then took up a position near the southern edge, where a cluster of boulders offered some minimal cover. Nora stood in the center, a clear and defiant target. It was her play, her challenge. She had to be the one he saw first. They waited. Every minute stretched into an eternity. The desert sun beat down on them. Was he coming? Or was he already surrounding them, his men crawling through the gullies and washes below, ready to turn the mesa into a killing floor? Had they miscalculated? Had his rage at the destruction of his mine overridden his greed? Just as a sliver of doubt began to creep into Nora's mind, she saw it. A lone rider approaching from the direction of the Obsidian Ranch. A man on a powerful black horse, moving at a steady, unhurried pace. Even from a distance, she could see the glint of the sun on the silver-plated revolver at his hip. It was Blackwood, and he was alone. It was too easy. It felt wrong. Silas shifted in the rocks, his rifle trained on the approaching figure. "It's him," he said, his voice low. "But stay sharp. This feels like a performance." Blackwood rode right up to the base of the mesa and stopped. He tilted his head back, his cold eyes finding Nora instantly. A slow, mocking smile spread across his face. "An impressive display, Mrs. Whitfield," he called out, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "Your husband would be surprised. You have my attention. Now what is this foolishness about?" "The terms are simple, Blackwood," Nora shouted back, her voice ringing with a confidence she didn't feel. "You ride up here and leave the gun. Then you ride away. Do that, and what's left of your mind will be spared." Blackwood laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You are in no position to make demands. You are a thief and a murderer, standing beside another. My men have this entire area surrounded. You have nowhere to run." "Then why did you come alone?" Silas called from the rocks. Blackwood's smile tightened. To offer you a more civilized solution, a final transaction. He reached into his coat and pulled out something. Not a weapon, a piece of paper, a deed. I know where the ledger is, Silas. Barlow wasn't as loyal as I thought. He made his own inquiries. He held up the paper. He found the deed to the bank box, and he sold it to me just before a rather unfortunate accident befell him this morning. The sheriff was dead. Blackwood was tying up loose ends. Nora's blood ran cold. I have the key, Blackwood continued, patting the Colt at his hip. And now I have the location of the lock. It's over. But I am a generous man. I will give you this. He gestured to the vast empty desert around them. Your lives. Ride out of this territory and never return, in exchange for your silence. It was a checkmate. He had won. He had everything. The ledger, the key, the mine. He had gotten away with John's murder. He was just here to gloat, to see the final despair in their eyes before he had his men close the net. The rage inside Nora was so immense, so pure, it felt like it would burn her alive. All of this, the fight, the risk, John's sacrifice, had been for nothing. But then she saw it. Something was wrong with the picture. Blackwood was a man who loved control, who loved power. He was holding a deed, yes, but why was he here? Why the grand speech? If he already had everything, he could have just sent his men to kill them. Why come himself? Unless the deed was a fake. Unless Barlow the snake had sold him a lie before he died. He's bluffing, Nora whispered, her eyes locked on Blackwood. Barlow sold him a forgery. He still doesn't know where the box is. He's trying to trick us into confirming he has the right information. Silas followed her gaze, his mind racing. It made perfect sense. Blackwood wasn't here to gloat. He was here to get the final piece of the puzzle, to make sure the key he held actually fit the lock he'd been sold. You're a liar, Blackwood, Nora yelled, her voice filled with conviction. You have a worthless piece of paper. Barlow played you for a fool. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Blackwood's face. The mocking smile vanished, replaced by a cold fury. He had overplayed his hand. In that single fleeting moment, Nora knew she was right. They still had a chance. A tiny, desperate chance. It doesn't matter, Blackwood snarled, his composure cracking. I have the key. I will find the box. And you will be dead. He reached for the Colt. But as his hand closed around the walnut grip, another voice rang out across the mesa. A new voice. I wouldn't do that if I were you, Mr. Blackwood. From behind a rock formation on the far side of the mesa, a man stood up. He was tall, dressed in a dusty but official-looking suit, and he was holding a government-issue rifle. And behind him, more men rose from the rocks. 5, 10, 15 of them. Not Blackwood's thugs. These were uniformed men, United States Marshals. The real law had arrived. Blackwood froze, his hand hovering over the Colt. His face, which had been a mask of rage, was now pale with shock and disbelief. He slowly turned his head, looking at the ring of lawmen that had materialized out of nowhere. His trap had been turned into a cage, and he was the one inside it. The lead marshal, a stern-faced man with a thick mustache, walked forward calmly. Marcus Blackwood, he said, his voice booming with authority, you are under arrest for the murder of Pinkerton agent John Whitfield, and for conspiracy, fraud, and a list of other crimes so long it'll take us a week to read them to you. Silas lowered his rifle, a look of stunned relief on his face. He looked over at Nora, who was staring, speechless, at the impossible scene unfolding before her. Jeb, Silas breathed. That old goat. When he went for help, he didn't just get John's friends. He rode all night to Prescott. They hadn't just been buying time for a bluff. They had been buying time for the cavalry to arrive. Jeb's diversion hadn't just been for the mine. It was to keep Blackwood's men occupied and scattered while the marshals moved into position. The entire confrontation on the mesa had been the final piece of a much larger plan. A plan John had set in motion years ago. Blackwood, realizing he was cornered, finally snapped. With a wild cry of rage, he drew the Colt. 45. Not to shoot the marshals. That would be suicide. He aimed it at the one person who had caused all of this. the one who had unraveled everything. He aimed it at Nora. He never got the shot off. A single rifle crack echoed across the mesa. It wasn't from the marshals. It was from Silas. The bullet hit Blackwood square in the shoulder, spinning him around. The Colt flew from his grasp, landing in the dust a few feet away. Blackwood crumpled to the ground, clutching his arm, his face a twisted mask of pain and hatred. It was over. Marshals swarmed the mesa, clapping Blackwood in irons. Others fanned out, rounding up his scattered, leaderless men. The reign of Marcus Blackwood had ended, not with a bang, but with the quiet, satisfying click of handcuffs. Nora walked slowly, almost in a daze, toward the spot where the gun had fallen. She knelt in the dust and picked it up. Her husband's gun, the cause of so much pain, but also, in the end, the key to justice. She held it in her hands, the metal warm from the sun, the grip worn smooth by the touch of the man she had loved. Silas came and stood beside her. "He's gone, Nora. It's done." She looked up at him, tears finally blurring her vision. They weren't tears of grief, not anymore. They were tears of relief, of release. She thought of John, the quiet, gentle man she had known, and the brave, secret agent she had not. He had fought his battle in the shadows, and now she and Silas had finished it in the sun. She looked at the Colt in her hand. She knew the key was inside, the final proof. She pressed the tiny hidden catch on the walnut grip. A small section of the wood popped open on a hinge, revealing a tiny, hollowed-out compartment. And inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, was a single, ornate brass key. John's last secret. The final piece of the puzzle that would lock Blackwood away forever. They rode away from the mesa not as fugitives, but as witnesses. The head marshal had taken their statements along with the gun and the key. The ledger was recovered from the bank in Jerome, and it was everything Silas had promised. It was enough to dismantle Blackwood's entire criminal empire, piece by piece. The road ahead was still long and dusty, but for the first time it didn't feel like an escape. It felt like a beginning. Nora rode her own horse now, one recovered from Blackwood's ranch. Silas rode beside her. They didn't talk much, but the silence was different now. It was comfortable, easy, a silence between two people who had walked through fire together and come out the other side. They were free. John was avenged. A whole territory could breathe a little easier. But as they crested a ridge and looked out over the vast, beautiful, and dangerous land, Nora knew one thing for sure. Sometimes justice isn't found at the end of a trial. Sometimes you have to ride out and claim it for yourself. And sometimes the person you save turns out to be the one who saves you right back. The story of Nora Whitfield and the man named Silas became a whisper in the West, a tale of how a quiet widow and a condemned man brought down a king. It serves as a reminder that the biggest fires often start with the smallest spark. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales of justice from the dusty trails of the Old West, do us a favor. Hit that like button and make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next adventure. And let us know in the comments below. At what point did you realize Nora was no ordinary widow? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Thanks for riding along with us.